yes, as a police officer, you will have to use force.
Sometimes serving with compassion means to understand when force is not required.
Rephrase.
What does it mean to then serve with compassion?
To serve with compassion, to me, means to understand and authentically accept that we see our neighbor as ourselves. We value one another. We see our community as necessary for our existence. And so that's what serving with compassion means to me.
Jamiles Lartey, who's from the Marshall Project. It's an organization which monitors the U.S. criminal justice system. Jamiles, welcome to the program. Listen, if you don't mind, just remind us, at the time that Derek Chauvin was arresting George Floyd, was the chokehold, whether it be with the arm or with the knee or any other part of the body, was the chokehold a legal maneuver in American policing?
Well, it's difficult to speak of American policing. Here in America, we have 18,000 different police departments, and they all write their own rules, policies, and regulations. They all have their own training. Minneapolis had begun a series of reforms around that time. They had entered into an agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice to change some of their use of force practices. However, at that time, Minneapolis officers could still choke someone unconscious if the person was exhibiting active resistance. According to the department's policy, it was also allowed for officers to engage in lethal chokeholds. Those were deemed acceptable if deadly force would have also been justified. So in other words, if you would have been justified in shooting someone, you'd also be justified in choking them to death at that time.
Yeah, you raise a very important point, which actually Chief Arredondo has been asked about. The chief was presented with a list of actions that a suspect may be undertaking or may be guilty of. I mean, I say guilty of it. One of the examples is not being able to speak the language. In other words, what actions a suspect may be involved in that would justify possibly using more force. Out of the list, which was about 8 or so issues, while I was watching, the thing that really stood out for me, the only thing possibly, and I'm obviously not a lawyer, was suspected drug or alcohol use. And obviously that is going to be key in terms of at least the defense of Derek Chauvin in trying to persuade the court that it wasn't actually Chauvin's actions that killed George Floyd.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one thing I'd point out is, again, there are two conversations here, right? There's a conversation about whether or not Derek Chauvin was acting within in accordance with his training and in compliance with department regulations. And there's a separate conversation about whether or not his actions were criminal in any way. And so I think one of the things that we should be cautious about in trying to parse some of these questions about, was he in violation of policy? Was he not in violation of policies? They're obviously a part of the prosecution's overall strategy, but him violating policy or not is actually separate from the question of whether or not he committed a crime.
Jamiles, have we been able to establish, again, because I'm not a lawyer and I'm dipping in and out of the trial, when we heard from that doctor who pronounced George Floyd dead at the hospital, have we been able to determine exactly the time of death? Because the doctor said that he pronounced Floyd dead when Floyd arrived at the hospital. But for me, that isn't exact enough in terms of, was he alive even for a few minutes at the hospital, or was he dead on arrival?
Yeah, I don't have that in front of me. I believe if we go back and look at all of the testimony to this point, I don't think we have a clear answer. Obviously, a person is there's a time of death called, like that's an official designation that happens in in the medical field. But I'm not aware that is the. It's not clear to me whether or not George Floyd may have been dead before the actual calling of a time of death.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfair question in a way. Let me ask you something that's far more in your area of expertise. Right, Chief Arredondo is a non-white man. What sort of research has been done which shows how non-white police officers in the United States feel about policing with white colleagues, non-white communities?
Got you. I see what you're asking. I think what the research shows a few things. In terms of research about whether or not police officers of color are more or less likely to use violent force, most of the research I've seen appears to show that there's no discernible difference. That said, what we do have is a lot of qualitative evidence that officers of color spend much more time thinking about their interactions with communities of color, thinking about the harm that can cause, and trying to mitigate that harm. Again, that's qualitative. That's just what you hear in interviews and what you hear from people talking about what it's like to have been a Black police officer. I mean, another thing that we can say is that Chief Arredondo himself was involved in litigation about the protection of racist actors within that department many years ago. So he's someone who's obviously dealt with this question of racism within a department.
Jamiles, thank you so much indeed. Really appreciate you spending time with us. Jamiles Lartey from the Marshall Project.